guess we're going to call it. So thank you for attending. This is an update on the New York State geothermal drilling regulations, particularly as they relate to the ever-changing world of drilling deeper than 500 feet. It's been an interesting journey. A couple years ago, before NY-GEO 2023, I believe it was, there was legislation that was passed that kind of directed the DEC to start looking at how to regulate geothermal boreholes deeper than 500 feet. It's been identified as a way to try to minimize costs, reduce some costs, open up locations that the footprint simply doesn't exist to be able to do 30 or 40 or 50 or 100, 500 foot boreholes. So how can we maximize that? It's something that has happened in all parts of this country. Globally, drilling deeper than 500 feet is pretty normal. There's a lot of experience, especially at this conference, a lot of international participants here that look at us and say, why do you stop at 500 feet? It's easy to go to 6 or 8, and then they start talking meters and my mind goes blank. So we're gonna start off with Carrie Friello. She works in the Division of Mineral Resources. She has been a very powerful ally over the last couple of years. We've spent a lot of time talking, trying to go through the different situations and some of the things that we see. And we know that New York State is a very different state depending on what part you're talking about. New York City, Long Island, the North Country, Albany, you start heading into Western New York, and it's a hodgepodge. We see everything in New York State that the rest of the country sees in a much more normalized setting. You go to Oklahoma, it's pretty consistent. You go to down south and they see some consistent stuff. We get everything. We get sands, we get gravels, we get salt, we get gas, we get all of it in one shot. We've got very dense rocks, we've got very porous rock, and so drilling is it's a fun exercise. We have a lot of fun with it, and as I said before we got going, it's always the driller's fault, so you can always blame us. We've got thick skin. We just make the rig louder so we can't hear you, and we ignore you. So we're going to do what we're going to do. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, and she's going to give a pretty detailed presentation on what the DEC is working on. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Kevin.
I'll go this way.
All right, sounds like a plan. Hi, everyone. Just to give you a little bit of background about me and the DEC in general, in particular the Division of Mineral Resources as it relates to drilling over 500 feet in depth. I am with the Division of Mineral Resources. I am their regulatory and climate coordinator. So the Division of Mineral Resources is just one division in a very large Department of Environmental Conservation. I, as my title suggests, coordinate the development of the division's regulations and policies and also implementation of the climate law for both our Article 23 regulated wells program and our mine land reclamation program. I have 16 years of experience with well permitting in New York State. That includes geothermal, oil, natural gas, stratigraphic, underground gas storage, and brine disposal wells. So there have been a lot of wells drilled in New York State over 500 feet. Just not a lot of geothermal wells have gone deeper than 500 feet because of the permitting requirements that have been traditionally in place. So I think to kind of follow up on what Kevin was saying, there is the misconception that you couldn't drill deeper than 500 feet. That's never been the case. There has always been a permitting program for geothermal over 500. We are looking to streamline that program as a result of the legislation changes and to meet New York State's climate goals. So as part of my role, I am the lead for DEC's current efforts to promulgate regulations specific to closed-loop geothermal, boreholes deeper than 500 feet. And I am really happy to be here today to give you all an update on our rulemaking efforts. There we go. I'm going to cover a host of topics today, including an update on a recently finalized program policy, DMN3, that relieves the previous requirement for financial security for closed-loop stratigraphic test wells drilled deeper than 500 feet. I will explain our rulemaking process specific to closed-loop geothermal and closed-loop stratigraphic wells deeper than 500 feet. We're going to touch very briefly on drilling waste handling requirements and closed-loop geothermal completion reports. Before we get started, though, I do just want to take a second to touch on some terminology. I'm going to say closed-loop geothermal borehole and closed-loop stratigraphic well a lot today. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what these are, how they're the same, and how they're different. So well and borehole from DEC's perspective is interchangeable. Kevin's probably going to get mad at me for saying that because he wants me to use borehole, and we are doing so. But from DEC's perspective, they are all wells. So if you hear me interchange them, that is just part of our regulatory terminology. But I'll try to stick to the script on that. So in both cases, these are boreholes that are drilled. A closed loop pipe is inserted into them. They are grouted from total depth to surface, so they are the same in that respect. From DEC's perspective, a closed loop geothermal borehole is intended for geothermal heating and cooling, whereas a closed loop stratigraphic well is intended to determine the feasibility or technical specifications for a potential future geothermal project. So that closed loop stratigraphic well is not part of a larger common plan of development at the time it is drilled. And it currently would require an ECL Article 23 permit. So if you're going deeper than 500 feet. So the legislation change only applied to what we classify as geothermal boreholes, which are those directly intended for geothermal heating and cooling. In that instance, no Article 23 permit is currently required until DEC promulgates the regulations we're going to talk about today. So we're first going to touch on our program policy DMN3. This was finalized in July of 2024. It applies to closed loop stratigraphic test wells deeper than 500 feet only. It establishes guidance for DEC staff regarding the applicability of one provision in the Environmental Conservation Law, and that is 230305 14F, which gives the department the power to require financial security to ensure the ultimate plugging and abandonment of the wells that we regulate. This policy, however, provides guidance to staff that we are no longer going to require financial security for closed-loop stratigraphic test wells based on the way they are constructed. They are effectively plugged at the time that construction has finished. So we do not feel that financial security is appropriate for this well type, so we are reducing that burden. This is in place now. So if someone comes to us for a permit for a closed-loop stratigraphic test well over 500 feet, there will be no financial security requirement associated with it. Now I'll jump into the rulemaking process. In general, our rulemaking goals are to protect public health and safety, to protect groundwater, surface water, and natural resources while accounting for New York's variable geologic conditions. We want to promulgate these regulations as expeditiously as possible while ensuring an efficient permitting process. And that's pretty key. We believe that that really was the target of the legislation. It wasn't just to promulgate regulations quickly, and it wasn't just to make the process easier, it was both. So in our process of doing that, our goals are to reduce the administrative burdens and costs that were associated with the previous Article 23 permitting program that would have applied to this well type, and to provide clear, consistent, and transparent requirements. As part of our rulemaking process, we are considering standards and resources from CSA, IGSHPA, and the National Groundwater Association. We are also looking at the requirements of other states, neighboring states, and states across the country, and even provinces in Canada, particularly because other states, the states next door to us, and I think Dave will talk about this a little bit, do not have to factor in oil and natural gas possibilities in any portion of their state, whereas New York does. It may not apply here in downstate New York, but in western New York it is certainly a concern, and it is something that our regulations have to address. So as we so we are looking across the board at all of those items, and we are also considering, where appropriate, standards from the American Petroleum Institute and ASTM, particularly for those boreholes in, say, western New York, the southern tier, maybe central New York, where permanent casing might be required to protect groundwater from hydrocarbons that may be found in the subsurface, or from brine that may be found in the subsurface. So our rulemaking proposal, known as draft express terms, or what you would think of as the language of the regulations themselves, will focus on drilling and installation in particular of closed-loop geothermal boreholes and closed-loop stratigraphic wells over 500 feet in depth. The legislation change only directed us to write regulations for closed-loop geothermal. We are extending it to closed-loop stratigraphic wells because their construction is so similar and the concerns would be the same. We plan to organize our rulemaking by updating our existing Part 550, so this is 6 NY-CRR, Part 550 of the regulations. This is a general area of our regulations that provide definitions. So we need to add some definitions specific to geothermal to this section in order to provide clarity for the remainder of the regulations. And we also intend to repeal some outdated descriptions of our divisions organization. So these regulations have not been updated since the 1980s. There's some old information in there that does not have a direct impact on the regulated communities that we regulate, and it is incorrect at this point in time. So that will be removed from the regulations as part of this process. We also intend to add a new Part 561 specific to closed-loop geothermal wells. We hope that it will be one-stop shopping for all the requirements related to the drilling of closed-loop geothermal wells. That does not mean that there are not other regulations that DEC implements that impact drilling, waste handling, or disposal, and we can touch on those a little bit later. We also plan to add a new Part 563 to focus on stratigraphic wells. At this point in time, 563 will focus exclusively on closed-loop stratigraphic wells and will likely include a lot of references to Part 561 since the requirements will be the same. At a later date, through a separate rulemaking process, we will expand Part 563 to cover other types of stratigraphic wells, but that will not be addressed at this time. These regulations are designed to cover boreholes for residential, commercial, district, and utility scale projects. We are focused exclusively on the boreholes, however, siting and construction. The regulations will not address closed-loop geothermal boreholes more shallow or shallower than 500 feet, and they will not address open-loop or standing column geothermal wells deeper than 500 feet. Standing column wells and open-loop geothermal wells are still subject to our existing regulations at Part 550 to 559. They still require permits and will be handled through a separate process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is envisioned for this rulemaking, and I want to emphasize as I do that these are DEC's ideas at this point. The rulemaking process is a lengthy process, and it involves multiple opportunities for stakeholder and public input, which means what DEC is thinking today might not be what the rule looks like at the end of the day, because it will be informed by the input of a whole host of interested stakeholders and the public. So please keep that in mind as we talk about this. One of the things that our rulemaking will most likely involve is permit application requirements. We are envisioning a permitting program for these well types over 500 feet. The goal with that permitting program is to allow for safety, but also site-specific flexibility as necessary. We envision having a qualified contractor registration, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but the goal would be to issue permits to a qualified contractor. In the case of, say, residential wells, for example, we don't want to be issuing permits to homeowners, to the owner of the well. We want to be dealing with drillers or consultants or engineering firms when we're issuing our permits. The rulemaking would include appropriate borehole setbacks and surface restrictions. These might be from water wells or surface water bodies, property boundaries, buried utilities, again with a focus on public safety and environmental protection. We will focus on borehole design, drilling, and installation requirements. We envision having a reporting requirement for completion and decommissioning. Our goal is to streamline those requirements for this industry relative to our previous reporting requirements, but we do still envision that reporting would be a portion of our regulatory program. And we will have a limited number of decommissioning requirements. These requirements that we are considering in combination with the permitting program that we are planning are consistent with but more comprehensive than the voluntary best management practices that DEC issued to NY-GEO in October of 2023 when the legislation change occurred. So to talk a little bit more about the qualified contractor. The qualified contractor must hold a valid and current certification or accreditation related to the drilling or decommissioning of closed-loop boreholes from an approved organization or association. The goal with the qualified part, we're not trying to make this difficult. We are only trying to make a standardized process whereby someone is accountable to DEC. That is the goal. So the certifications and accreditations under consideration are those from National Groundwater Association and NY-GEO. We, at this point, are planning to designate these approved accreditations through our policy process as opposed to the actual regulations themselves. So the regulations are envisioned to say a permit must be issued to a qualified contractor and to define what a qualified contractor is. And we'll go on to say, you know, as determined by the department. We will be putting out a policy separately that will go out for public comment. We'll get stakeholder input that will actually include the approved certifications and accreditations. The goal in using the policy process is that it still involves stakeholder input, but it is a much shorter, much less cumbersome process to get through, which means that if there are additional certifications or accreditations that become available in the future, or certification and accreditations are changed in any way, we can respond to that much faster than we can moving through our rulemaking. So a big focus on our rulemaking relates to design and construction considerations. Kevin spoke to New York State's diverse geology. Many areas have an increased risk of encountering geologic hazards such as natural gas, oil, or brine in the subsurface, particularly when you go deeper than 500 feet. That is the origin of the 500-foot rule, so to speak. I realize that the group I'm speaking to, if you are, you know, Lower Hudson Valley, New York City, or Long Island, those concerns don't exist, and DEC recognizes that. So we are factoring that in as we look at developing these regulations. But borehole drilling, design, and construction standards, including the installation of cemented casing in areas with these geologic hazards, are critical to protect aquifers, public safety, and the environment. And therefore, the rulemaking is really going to focus on that design and construction consideration, with a focus on casing, cementing, and grouting requirements. The installation of permanent casing may be required if drilling hazards are identified. The goal of the maybe language isn't to create questions and cause concerns, it's to allow for site-specific determinations. It is to allow us to not require casing in certain locations while ensuring that casing is placed and is cemented and is, you know, seated at an appropriate depth in locations, say in Western New York and the Southern Tier, where we have concerns about hydrocarbons and brine. If DEC is requiring permanent surface casing for the sake of groundwater protection, we intend to require that it would be cemented, and the casing and cement would probably be required to conform to API and ASTM standards. We also would be looking to require that thermally enhanced grouts must be bentonite or cement-based, and the grout must be able to maintain the thermal, hydrological, and mechanical properties over the lifetime of the borehole. You'll note on my slide there are several asterisks. We intend to write into the regulations some language that says unless otherwise approved by the department. The goal of that language is to provide flexibility so that if a project comes to us that has some set of unique circumstances and some other protective measures are proposed that DEC feels is sufficient, there would be room in the regulations for us to say not to require permanent surface casing be cemented in all instances. So we are trying to construct regulations in a way that provides for site-specific determinations and flexibility while also providing for some regulatory consistency. And as you can imagine, that's a bit of a balancing act. Some of the cost reduction and efficiency measures that we are envisioning from our previous Article 23 regulatory program includes not requiring financial security for these well types. So similar to the basis for DMN3 program policy that I discussed earlier, we do not envision a financial security component. We also do not envision any annual reporting associated with these wells. Our other well types regulated under Article 23 do have a reporting requirement. We do not envision carrying that through in this rulemaking. We envision one permit being issued per project, whether the project is a single borehole or a multi-borehole field. We would be issuing one permit. This is a substantial improvement from what our previous Article 23 program was, which was a single permit for every individual borehole or well drilled. So this should be a substantial reduction in paperwork, both for the applicant and for DEC. We also anticipate a nominal project-based application fee. This would be a reduced fee as compared to the variable depth per well fees that have been associated with all Article 23 wells in the past. And there would be a federal, state, and local agency exemption from those fees. Though that exemption is already written into the environmental conservation law, so we would just be carrying that through to these well types and fees. We envision the creation of a streamlined electronic application and also streamlined completion and decommissioning report forms for closed-loop projects. So we will be developing a brand new set of regulatory forms that eliminate the fields that only apply to our other well types and do not apply to this industry to try to make any reporting that we do have in the application process easier and more efficient. We are also proposing to develop a generic environmental impact statement, or GEIS, specific to closed-loop boreholes and wells. The goal of this GEIS is to streamline permit issuance. So this GEIS would be developed concurrently with the rulemaking. It will fulfill the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR, requirements for the rulemaking and permitting process. So SEQR requires that agencies determine if the actions they approve or permit have a significant impact on the environment. SEQR also applies to rulemaking processes and policy development. So our goal in writing this GEIS, or a GEIS in general, is to evaluate separate actions, in this case, separate permit issuance actions that have common impacts. And the preparation of this GEIS now will ultimately reduce administrative burden on the industry and expedite DEC's permitting process once our regulations are promulgated. So to kind of walk you through what that looks like, without a GEIS, if an application is received, the applicant would need to submit DEC's Environmental Assessment Form Part 1. I don't know how many people are familiar with that form, but it is a multi-page form. It is an investment in time. It requires quite a bit of due diligence and homework. DEC would then complete Part 2 and Part 3 of the form. Part 3 of the form requires DEC to make a decision on whether there will be any significant adverse environmental impacts from the project. If there are, we would issue a positive declaration, and an environmental impact statement would be needed for an individual project. If no significant environmental impacts are issued or are identified, however, DEC would issue a negative declaration and then be able to move forward with permit issuance. If we write the GEIS now, it will describe actions and thresholds in the GEIS that will make projects consistent with the GEIS and the regulations that we're writing. So then a project can be evaluated against the GEIS. If it is consistent, we can move forward with permit issuance. We will fill out one small form internally, and it will be done. No additional questions to the applicant, no long process. If, however, something is proposed that is not consistent with what is described in the GEIS, there's still an avenue to move forward. The applicant would still be asked to submit the longer environmental assessment form, and then it would move through the process that you see at the top of the screen. So there is still an avenue to propose something unique that might not be covered in the GEIS, but our goal is to capture the majority of the projects through that GEIS so that we can reduce the administrative burden on the industry for permit issuance. So the goal with this really is that the GEIS will help to provide regulatory certainty in addition to permitting efficiencies. So we're going through a rulemaking process and we're starting a GEIS process, and these two processes are going to run concurrently and they're going to have milestones that overlap. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what this is going to look like. The rulemaking process begins with public outreach. And we've been talking to NY-GEO now for a couple of years. That doesn't qualify as formal outreach, but it certainly is informing where we are today and where we're going to go. So we will begin formal public outreach with a release of a draft scope for a GEIS for public comment. This draft scope can be thought of as an outline to lay out what the GEIS will evaluate, what DEC will commit to evaluating in the GEIS. And while it is out for public comment, we will hold stakeholder meetings. DEC at this point intends to hold 2 virtual meetings. The public and any interested stakeholder are welcome to attend. We will give an overview, and then we will take comments and questions during that time. We will also be accepting written comments during the comment period, both on our regulations themselves and on the draft scope for the GEIS. When that comment period closes, we will evaluate the comments we've received. We will make any necessary edits to the draft scope to the GEIS and issue a final scope. We will also be looking at any revisions necessary to our thoughts on what the rulemaking will entail. The next milestone will be a concurrent release of the draft rule package and the draft GEIS for public comment. There will be a public comment period of no less than 65 days, during which public hearings will be held to accept verbal comments on both documents, and written comments will also be accepted. When the comment periods close, DEC will evaluate those comments received. We will make changes if necessary to the GEIS and to the rule itself. We will prepare an assessment of public comment, so we will respond to the comments received, and then we will issue the final GEIS and assessment of public comment. 10 days later, we will issue the final rule and the GEIS finding statement concurrently. They will be effective upon issuance, and then we will be able to move forward with permitting. This whole process take about a year. It is lengthy, it is involved, and the addition of the GEIS is going to add a little bit more time up front to what DEC needs to do in hopes that it reduces administrative burden later on for the industry. So until we promulgate the regulations, if you are drilling geothermal, closed-loop geothermal wells over 500 feet, it will remain unregulated from a drilling perspective. Now we're going to touch on drilling waste handling very quickly. I know that there are lots of questions related to drilling waste handling. The regulations that address drilling waste handling and disposal are not proposed to be changed as part of the rulemaking that the Division of Mineral Resources is currently undertaking. These regulations include DEC's solid waste regulations at 6 NY-CRR parts 360 to 364, and our state pollution discharge elimination system program at 6 NY-CRR part 750. These regulations are implemented by 2 other programs at DEC. The Division of Materials Management, Bureau of Solid Waste Management, handles the solid waste regulations. The Division of Water Bureau of Permits handles the SPEEDIES program. These are DEC's experts on these programs and the requirements of them. They are fairly nuanced requirements. I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert on them. I deal with them as it relates to regulated well types, but essentially Mineral Resources' role is to make sure that you comply with requirements that are not ours to implement. So if you have questions, whether it relates to current projects or future projects related to how to properly manage your drilling waste, you need to reach out to the appropriate individuals. I've listed some contact information on the screen. These people are more than happy to try to answer your questions. They are the appropriate points of contact for any detailed scenario that you might want to present, because there are lots of nuances that go into these regulations and how they work together and what is required. And last but not least, I want to touch on closed-loop geothermal completion reports. I don't know, by show of hands, can we see how many people in the room have been involved with a geothermal project deeper than 500 feet since October of 2023? Couple? Okay. Well, I have a request for you. If you've been involved and are in a position to do so, please submit the voluntary completion report that NY-GEO developed. Please submit this to NY-GEO or to DEC. These completion reports we have no mechanism for requiring them, but it would be the only record that DEC has access to that tells us where these deep boreholes are located throughout the state. It kind of lends continuity to the record keeping that DEC has related to deep boreholes, prior to the new regulations. So if we don't receive a completion report or some type of location information, we have no idea where these boreholes exist. You may not view that as an issue. DEC views it as less than desirable. And once the regulations are promulgated, should there be any complaints, DEC will have to look at boreholes in the area, and if your borehole was drilled during this period where we are not regulating, that's not an issue, but we would need to know where it is, as opposed to during the period where we are regulating. If the borehole is drilled during that period without a permit, then there's an enforcement issue. So it would be nice if DEC knows about the wells drilled during this interim period. You are not obligated to report, so this is just a request to keep our records as up to date as we can, at least with location information. Thank you.
On that completion report side of things, because we did spend a lot of time as part of our NY-GEO deeper than 500-foot subcommittee. We didn't come up with an acronym for that. We probably should have. We've talked to professionals north of the border, in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, all over New York State, and it's a very powerful tool. It does provide information that will help create some of the regulations as we move forward. So if you are drilling deeper than 500 feet, please do your homework. It's no more strenuous than a water well completion report. It's a very simple one-pager. Please do it. I can't chase you down, but I can pretend to yell at you. Up next, we have Dave Hermaniton with Brightcore, and he's going to touch briefly on some of the regulations that he has seen, he has worked with over the years in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey. Obviously, a little bit different geological setting out there. They have some different regulations that we look at, and he's going to give a brief overview, and then we'll get into some questions. I'm sure that there's maybe one or two, and I want to see Max run back and forth as fast as he can from one side of the room to the other. So you're up, Dave.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin. Yeah, again, my name is Dave, not David, unless my mom is mad at me. Yeah, this is a big deal. That was a really informative, comprehensive presentation. I'm not going to present anything near as technical as that. This is kind of like a reaction video to this news. Like, I'm a stakeholder in New York. I probably started in geothermal as an engineer slash hydrogeologist a little over 20 years ago, mostly open loop systems, but eventually stand and column well systems. I used to work over at PW Grosser. And we did a fair amount of work, I think back in like late aughts. I remember back in 2008 having to do the permitting process for stand and column wells, and it was fairly complex, but there are a lot of implications. You know, the financial security for a single stand and column well was, I think, $2,500 or something, and that's not the biggest deal when you're working on a $500,000, $1 million project. When you have to get security for 10 wells, like when PW Grosser did St. Pat's Cathedral, 25 grand wasn't a big deal for a multi-million-dollar project. But we always hit the brakes really hard when it came to closed loop projects, and we're looking at 100 boreholes and having to get financial security for 100 boreholes and fill out 100 permits was just like a total non-starter. And even before that, the sales process, when you're trying to sell, you know, clean tech, you know, our technology that you probably heard 100 times over, it's like, you know, this sort of little-known technology that's just coming up to speed. 20 years ago, people were like, "Nope, you know, what is this first off, and why would I ever possibly consider doing this?" So, like, the reaction to all this is you know, a good one. So, And I think one of the important things to put in perspective too now is with the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of times when we're trying to sell these projects and get the credit for meeting a certain amount of energy use that's coming from geothermal, renewable energy, it's hard to hit those targets in urban areas. So that 500-foot threshold often becomes the go, no-go on a project that could have some significance to the state's decarbonization efforts. So yeah, the reaction is great that this is happening. It's still, important that everyone understands that there are things that are going to be, we're faced with that are going to differ from other states. Every state has its nuances. I'm an engineer. I usually, in my company, I'm not an ops person, so I don't deal with what I'm about to speak to. So I phoned a friend and just grabbed some talking points from projects and dealing with regulators. Connecticut, that there's no trigger for a special permit past any particular depth. And likely this is something that had to do with it's not a very diverse state geologically. There's like pretty much Connecticut River Valley, that is, a shale area, a lot of other hard crystalline rock around the state. That state adopted new permitting requirements or licensing requirements late last year. It's something that kind of snuck up on the industry by surprise. I was part of the NY-GEO Association for some time, and they put forth regulations that were never adopted by the state, but the last bullet I have there, they were adopted by local municipalities, some of them. So they took the draft Connecticut geothermal regulations and in cities, in towns like Greenwich, or Westport, Wilton, they would just pop up with the state, with the local board that they adopted those regs and they had to be adhered to locally. Just some things about drilling in urban areas. Sometimes the regulations that are written for statewide really aren't applicable to urban areas. One of the big concerns is having water from a geothermal system or a geothermal well create a conduit for sewer or septic water to get into the groundwater. So it's something that when you're drilling in areas where there aren't public water supplies, big concern because people have wells on their properties. But when you're working in an urban area, it's hard to have meet setback requirements. So the state is very flexible to be able to talk to stakeholders, the people building systems to provide variances. So another, I guess, reaction to what the state's doing in New York. New York is a very large state. I have worked with DEC for a lot of environmental work over the years as well, and the state's generally underfunded. Like the resources that the state has to complete all their work, is limited. So it's very difficult to get through to certain people in the regional offices or in the Albany office. Guys work a lot, and it's great to hear that you're going to shoehorn in the ability for people to reach out to you directly to discuss getting variances because one size doesn't fit all. And similar in Massachusetts. And there's someone that works for the DEP. I don't know if anyone knows Joe Cerruti. Someone that you could reach out to and contact and discuss getting a variance for a project. Again, it'd be great that New York is looking at this holistically, that it's not just a set of regulations that's going to be put in place and you can't, they're unwavering. So yeah, just a little bit of information from my ops group that they're using the same regs that were established back in 2012 in Massachusetts. It's difficult getting some permitting that has to do with the wastewater management in Massachusetts. So it's going to be interesting, to Carrie's point about the environmental regulations that are going to have to be considered for this sort of, this going deeper than 500 feet. I'm sure there are going to be areas where this is pretty complicated. Generally in urban areas, when we're doing work, we're working with the environmental engineer that has already done all the investigations with the state, and they've established what the requirements are for disposing of materials and disposing of water, and that generally has to get worked out with the authority having jurisdiction and what you're going to do with your water, how it's going to get treated, and then how it's either going to go to a sewer system or get disposed of in another way. In Jersey, actually, truthfully, I don't have a lot of experience in New Jersey. A couple projects that we know there's no depth trigger. Grouting is an issue in New Jersey because they've had issues with grout getting into their wastewater treatment plants, destroying some of their the head end pumps at wastewater treatment plants. So they're very sensitive to that. And most there's like almost a line in New Jersey where if you're near the industrial areas that are sort of like those flatland areas and the marshes, you have a very strict grouting and casing requirement unless you get leniency on it. And there's also on the books the use of a specialized cementatious grout that was, I think, something that had good intentions to be able to keep those areas from having cross-contamination, but it's very difficult to use. Then other areas, you're able to get an exception where you can use kind of grouts that are more standard to the industry, like, the GeoPro grouts that most people use, or, Setco or some of the other manufacturers are accepted with special exception from the state. So yeah, that's sort of all I have, like my reaction video to this good news.
Thank you. So I guess at this point, we'll go the fun route of questions. I'm sure there's some. Get to running, Max.
Is the DEC going to look to define the lifetime of a well? I know you said the grout needs to be kind of characteristic of the properties to match the lifetime of the well itself. Are you going to publish, I guess, to define lifespan on the equipment itself?
Thank you, Cole Burgess from NYS RG&E. Please state your name and who you're with before you ask your question.
I think that's something that DEC
Gotta flip it up.
I think that that's something that DEC needs to consider. At this point, it is not something that we have set any set timeframes on. That is something that we would certainly welcome stakeholder feedback on during our outreach period.
Yes.
I'll be there in 2 minutes.
While we wait, I do have a question. I wrote it on her piece of paper in my chicken scratch. So at some point in the slides, you were talking about special circumstances in design and use of casing and special grouting, which we know industry, we can grout anything. We don't care what it is. We have a system for it. We have a pipe for it. But would there be a situation where a stratigraphic test well, to use your terms, done to the standard shows that the risk that we thought might be there does not exist? Would you be able to grant a variance on a permit for a site?
Just to clarify your question, you're asking if you drill a stratigraphic test well and we have data from it and it shows that what we thought was a risk isn't really a risk at the location, would it change how we would require wells to be constructed when the geothermal project moves forward?
Correct.
And the answer is yes. We would definitely factor in information that results from a test well into the permitting of the actual geothermal project. I guess I'll go a little further with my answer to say, we still anticipate and expect that applicants will be doing their due diligence based on available information on what is in the area you're drilling. What do you know about the subsurface risks? We will also be doing our due diligence during application review. We will look at water wells in the area. We will look at other deep wells drilled in the area. We will look at the records we have access to determine if we think casing needs to be installed or needs to be set at a certain depth, needs to be cemented, or if none of that is necessary. So we still anticipate that when you're designing your wells, you're going to do your due diligence with information available publicly, and we're going to do our due diligence at DEC during permitting to make sure that we're all on the same page about those risks. So if there is information from a test well, that absolutely should be factored into the permitting process.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm George Coffin. I'm with Department of Public Service for New York State. I guess my question is for Carrie. I know you mentioned in your presentation that you were looking to do one permit per geothermal borehole project. So if you were looking at a case like the U10 pilots, where there may be multiple bore fields, how would you look at permitting for those situations?
So I think each geographic location would be permitted as its own project for a U10. So if the wells are all interconnected in that area, we would look at that as a single project, a single disturbance, if you will. And then if there is some geographic break in the bore fields, we might look at that as a separate project. Seeker requires that the agency look at the whole action. So for something like a U10 project, it obviously isn't just Division of Mineral Resources, Article 23 permits that would be necessary. There may be other permits necessary from DEC, from local governments. In those instances, there may be additional seeker review for the whole project that goes beyond the scope of just the boreholes themselves. Our generic environmental impact statement will cover the drilling of the boreholes. It will not necessarily, for U10 projects, cover the impacts of the entire project as a whole. So we can say the boreholes are consistent with what's described in the GEIS. There may still be other aspects of the project that require evaluation, and you may still end up submitting a long-form environmental assessment form to the agency, but hopefully it wouldn't be for the boreholes themselves. That is the part that minerals can help streamline.
We got one in the center. It's like that dice game, left, right, center.
Hello, I'm Austin with Aztec Geothermal, and I just had a quick question about where the defining line between a stratigraphic and a geothermal well lies, since I know, especially moving forward, a lot of people are trying to plan their stratigraphic wells so that they're a part of the finalized bore field. So just quick point on when it's a stratigraphic well versus a geothermal well.
If it is planned to be part of the finalized bore field, so you know you're going to drill a bore field in that location at some point, and you're trying to determine, you know, how deep will it be and other technical specifications, but you know you're going to tie that borehole in, then it does not require a permit. It is part of that larger common plan of development. We would consider it geothermal. If at the time you're drilling that borehole, you do not know that it's going to be used for geothermal development, if there's really a question about will we drill the rest of the bore field in this location or won't we, then it is a stratigraphic test well to DEC, and then it does require an Article 23 permit today, as of right now, as opposed to in the future when we promulgate regulations. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, very much.
Great.
Anyone else?
My name is John with Associated Environmental. The question I had is if you do the permitting for a borehole that's 600 feet and there's issues with it, whether it's environmental or whatever, and we decide to say, oh, fine, we'll just do 499-foot boreholes, is it still going to be regulated, or?
So if you're planning a borehole with a total planned depth of 600 feet, anything over 500, it would require a permit once the regulations are promulgated. If during the drilling process you run into an issue and your total depth is no longer going to be below 500, deeper than 500, then you would notify us of that. It would change what requirements the well is subject to moving forward, because
Right.
it would no longer be subject to the regulations that we're promulgating. So
So say you wanted to case it, and now we're going 500 feet. Would 100 feet is going to make it? I'm trying to answer my own question, but I'm just.
I think it depends on the location that you're drilling. It would, if you are drilling more, if you end up drilling more shallow than 500 feet, and you have a permit, And it was in an area where DEC said you're required to install permanent surface casing to a certain depth with cement, and then the well falls outside of Mineral Resources Regulatory Authority, we would not have the authority to hold you to that, but there would probably be a good reason to stick to that from a best management practice, because it was required for a reason for environmental protection. So we couldn't enforce that at that point, I don't believe.
Can you lower the licensing fee for New York State for a driller? It's expensive.
That one's outside of my purview, I'm sorry.
You got to come to a SWATA for that. We'll have conversations there. It's not that bad.
Cole Burgess from NYSEG and RG&E.
Thank you.
As far as overall permitting timeline, what would the expectation be for, say, a U-10 with a bore field? What would, I guess, the general timeline for expectation be from, I guess, a state perspective? And you anticipate whatever, however you want to caveat it.
I think that is a great question. I think we are too early in our rulemaking process for me to be able to to accurately estimate that time frame, to be honest with you. I think it will depend on exactly what the rules are. And as I said, what I presented today are DEC's ideas. We feel pretty good about them, but they are just ideas, and we are looking for stakeholder input on them. So they are subject to revision as we move through the project, and I think the final rule is really what will determine permitting timeframes, in addition to the number of permit applications DEC receives at any one point in time.
Anybody else? I will throw out there that we're talking about, since if I go back to the beginning of this is update on drilling regulations, not just specifically to deeper than 500. The process has begun, conversations have begun to look at borehole regulations shallower than 500 feet in New York State. Very early in that process, it's kind of a brought back up version from a 2019 legislative action that died with just not a lot of momentum behind it. So NY-GEO, the Empire State Water Well Drillers Association, we are engaged with DEC, Division of Water, to talk about that. There's not an awful lot to go into on that with details right now. The general gist of it, from our perspective, both as a water well driller and a geothermal driller, is we want borehole completion reports every hole that you put into our ground. We want to know where they are. We want to know who did them. We want to make sure that they were grouted properly. We want to know if they encountered something that maybe we didn't think was there. It happens. My company's 90 years old. We've drilled, 25,000 holes in New York State. Most of them were shallow because we wanted water. Now all of a sudden we go to 300 feet, 400 feet, 450, 500. I'm a Western New York guy, so I don't drill deeper than 500 feet. But you start seeing things that you didn't know were there. And one of the really nice things, I think, that between our Empire State Drillers Conference and NY-GEO is collaboration. There's no secret sauce. Share. Communicate. If you have a question, call. I get calls from people all the time about, I want to drill an 800-foot hole in downtown Rochester. No, you don't. Or I want to drill in Syracuse. Well, you can. Just be careful because you're going to see salt in 80% of where you think you're going to be drilling. And then what do you do with it? Have a plan for it. There's always a way to make a borehole work. And between the EPA and the DEC and the contractors that we have with a world of experience, there's a way to make it happen. And there's a way to make it cost effective. There's never a no, it can't be done for a geothermal system anywhere in this country. It can be done. But the more we can communicate and get everybody on the same page of let's find a solution together, we're in good shape. So if nobody else has any other questions, I think we're going to wrap up on time. Carrie?
Can I
has a
just
comment?
add one thing?
Yes.
I just wanted to add, in terms of our stakeholder outreach process, when we move to formal outreach and we release the draft scope to the GEIS, we will certainly inform the board members at NY-GEO and let them inform you, but it will also be in DEC's environmental notice bulletin. There will be an announcement, and most likely it may be in the state register. So it won't be a secret. When the comment periods begin, we'll make sure NY-GEO is in the loop, and they can help make sure that all the interested stakeholders are in the loop. So please be on the lookout for that here moving forward in the near future.
If you're not sure, ask. Call somebody on the board. If we don't have the answer, we'll tell you. We'll get you in contact with the right person.
Quick question, might be a quick answer. This is Chris Stolicky with the New York State Department of Public Service. Are there federal regulations with Bureau of Land Management or other federal entities that come into play here? Or is New York regulations simply trump all others? How does that work?
New York regulations definitely don't trump all others. The EPA's underground injection control program would apply to geothermal wells that are open loop or standing column. You would need a permit from the UIC program at EPA if that well type is of interest to you, regardless of its depth. In terms of the Bureau of Land Management, I think that it would only apply to any federal lands, and there are very few in New York State. So that's unlikely, but if there is someone involved in a project on federal lands, it might not be a bad idea to reach out.
I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thought it got quiet on me. So, a lot of good topics from here on out. Test bores. I forget what they all are. I'm not organized, but stick around. Thank you, Carrie.